Well, hello, good evening. It's 5 o'clock here in beautiful downtown Luckett's, Virginia, and I hope to see some friends and followers and curious people tuning in. Otherwise, I'm just going to be sitting here talking to myself for an hour, which is not unusual, but I would love to have you join me and welcome friends. I see people are starting. I'm going to just briefly introduce myself here tonight for viewers who aren't familiar with who I am and what I do, and then do a quick overview of Syria as a country, very, very quick, and a brief overview of the year of 2018 and the changes that we've seen in Syria. I'd like to start by thanking Pam at Real Truth Now for helping me overcome my fear of being on live Facebook video. I've been hesitant to do this and we'll give it a try. Please be patient with me. I am a little nervous and hopefully won't embarrass myself too much here. So I'll talk a little bit and then we'll open it up for questions and would very much like to have you all chime in. So my name is Janice Kortkamp, and I've been researching Syria for over 6 years and have put in over 7,000 hours in that research. And I've had the privilege of going to visit Syria 6 times. I spent about 3 weeks there each time. I started going in May of 2016. I do want to reiterate that I am 100% independent. I have no affiliations with any person, any group, any movement, any government, whether my government or a foreign government. I'm not paid by anyone to do any of this. I call it a labor of love and hate, because I've fallen in love with Syria and the Syrian people over the course of this last 6 years. And I've fallen in hate with my government's policies, our foreign policy, these wars, and particularly, of course, what we've done in Syria. People often ask me, okay, who's sponsoring you? Who's paying for your trips? My husband, his hard labor as a handyman paid for the first 3 trips. And that's because he is as much in love with and supports Syria as I do. And this is his contribution. And he says a big hello to everyone out there. But after that, after the first 3, it was simply too expensive for us. And so I had to go online to Facebook friends and followers and just say, I can't do this anymore. Can you help? And people were fabulous. I mean, it was just so encouraging because people from all over the world were sending in money, $10 here, $50 here, a couple $100 there. And they, by doing that, have made the last 3 trips possible. I can never, ever thank you all enough for that help and support. And for those who just have supported me all throughout these years and shared my stories and encouraged me, I could not do this without you all. I'd be in some kind of loony bin by now. I do not go on Syrian government-sponsored trips. This is another classic line. The Syrian government does not organize my trips. They don't help me with my trips. I pay for everything. There were 2 incidences when I got hotel rooms for free. This is very typical of Syrian gracious hospitality. People there have been so welcoming and friendly, and they were just really thankful that somebody was willing to go when the war was still hot and things were still pretty dangerous, and just to go see for themselves what was going on and to try to tell people back home the reality on the ground. And so I did receive 2 hotel rooms free, but that's the extent of it. I've traveled around much of the country. It's a beautiful country. It looks very similar to Southern California. With fabulous history, culture, food, just an amazing, amazing place. If I get to go there another 100 times, I won't feel that I truly know it. It's endlessly fascinating. It's a deep culture, deep civilization, and the people are just the finest. I mean, getting time with them has been a life-changing experience for me. What I do when I go is I try to meet with literally as many Syrians as I possibly can. I've met with hundreds of people there. I travel often on my own with just Syrian friends as guides and translators. Sometimes I'm with a group because I've organized 5 Truth Seeker tour groups to go into Syria. So sometimes I'm with those friends from Western countries who want to know more. And there are times that I'm with government representatives, and I've become friends with many of them. One is a dear sister now, and they're people too, and they are there to keep me safe and keep their country safe, and I respect them, and it's part of the deal because Syria is in a war for its existence, and so it's kind of the equivalent of somebody from Germany showing up on the doorstep of England in, say, 1940 and saying, I just want to wander around your country and meet people. That's that you can imagine how that would have been received by the English government. And yet the Syrian government has always worked with me and helped me and accommodated me and encouraged me to come and to just share the stories that I'm getting. And I always get told, if you see something bad, report that. If you see something good, report that. And this is one of the things that I respect very much about Syria. Just very briefly about Syria as a country, because most people in America and in the West don't have the first clue of what Syria is really like. Our news doesn't really go into what Syria is like to visit and to live in. And this is a brief paragraph I'd like to read. It's from an article called ISIS, Assad, and What the West is Missing About Syria. And it was written in 2014 and in Catholic World Report. And it's the testimony of Monsignor Giuseppe Nazaro, who was in Aleppo. And I'll just read this, it's very brief. He said, President Assad opened the country up to foreign trade, to tourism within the country and from abroad, to freedom of movement and of education for both men and women. Before the protests started, the number of women in the professional world had been constantly increasing. The university was open to all, and there was no discrimination on the basis of sex. The country was at peace. Prosperity was on the rise, and human rights were respected. A common home and fatherland to many ethnicities and 23 different religious groups, Syria has always been a place where all were free to believe and live out their creed. All relationships were characterized by mutual respect. The freedom that is purportedly being brought to us by these so-called rebels is precisely what this rebellion has taken away from us. So hopefully that'll give you a little taste of what Syria was really like before the war, and in fact, in most areas and in most circumstances, it still is. Very briefly to recap. Oh, hi, Maria. Hi, Peter. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for joining. A very brief recap of 2018, and then we'll get to questions. There's a lot of great news that's happened this year. And the big news is that the areas around Damascus, of course, and the south have been liberated. And this means that most of the country now is under government control. That means that stability and security and safety have been restored. This is excellent. And I can testify after being there just this past November that people are breathing easier. They're starting to think about their futures once again. Rebuilding is going on in most of the areas that had suffered damage. There are some areas, of course, that are so totally damaged that they have to just start from scratch. And those are the bigger projects that require foreign investment. That's very difficult with the U.S. and Western sanctions that are still in place against Syria. So if you want to help the Syrian people, really push for your governments to end those sanctions. That would be a huge step forward. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect. Life is still hard there, and people are struggling. And, the economy is down. And I just, I've been hearing reports that Heating fuel is hard to come by now. There are huge long lines. It's expensive to get. People are cold. It's cold there in the winter. And I'm hoping that that situation clears up for those of you who are in Syria. Other good news, United Arab Emirates has reopened their embassy. More are going to follow. I hear Bahrain is going to open theirs again soon. Flights have been reestablished between Damascus and Tunisia on sham wings. So things are starting to fall in place. Of course, refugees are returning. I saw videos of some more through the border of Jordan and from Lebanon coming back. I think the latest figure from the Russian military defense was 1.4 million have returned. So that's fabulous news. There are still battles to be fought. Of course, Idlib is the remaining stronghold of terrorist groups, and there are reported 50,000 to 70,000 armed terrorists there that control that area. And this is a problem that has to be solved. That area, those terrorist groups must be defeated. No country would allow an Al-Qaeda-dominated terrorist caliphate within their borders, and that's exactly what Idlib is. It's a desperate situation because many of those fighters are from other countries, and their home countries don't want them. Nobody wants them, and so this battle is going to have to be fought. I have no doubt that just like we saw in Aleppo and other areas, that the Syrians and the Russians, Iranians, etc., will make every effort to reduce collateral damage or damage to civilian areas and civilians as they possibly can. They always make safe corridors for people to escape through. They, announce the plans for an attack well beforehand so people have a chance to leave. And so, it's war. And so this area must be defeated. It will be defeated. And they will do everything they can to make that, to limit the damage as much as possible. The other situation that we have now, of course, is President Trump has announced that he's going to pull the U.S. troops out of Syria, which is great news if it happens. And of course, knowing the history of the American military, that is a huge if. Already he's backtracked on the deadline for it. It was 30 days. Now it's up to 70 days. 90 days, excuse me. We still don't know if that includes all U.S. forces or not. So is it just ground troops or is it commanders? And specifically what I'm looking for is whether that includes groups like Blackwater, these mercenary forces that we use to do our dirty work oftentimes. So there's a big if there. Hopefully it will happen. I'm really hoping it will happen. And please, please believe me, the vast majority of Syrians want the United States of America and our coalition forces out of their country. Seriously, that coalition is in Syria 100% illegally. The U.S. has done nothing to help the Syrian people. Absolutely the opposite. We've literally been in there supporting terrorist groups and making life a living hell for Syrians. They don't want us. They never asked us in. And they are more than capable of cleaning up the rest of ISIS and all of these, the rest of the terrorists that are in their country. So please, President Trump, please hold your ground, stay your course, and get the U.S. out of Syria. That would be a wonderful first step to restoring some kind of integrity in U.S. foreign policy. The Kurds will, of course, have to reconcile with Damascus. That's already in the process, already happening. And then, of course, you have Turkey that's looming, and to what extent Turkey will go to continue to violate the sovereignty of Syria. Again, they're forces that are in Syria 100% illegally. Turkey has to get out. And then there's still the illegal occupation of Israel in the Golan Heights. There is not one country that recognizes Israel's right to be squatting in the Golan Heights. And so this is another issue that hopefully will be addressed soon. But the two biggies right now are Idlib and the Northeast, where the U.S. forces are. So that's my basic talk. And does anyone have any questions? I think I've lost a lot that I've scrolled past, but is there anyone that would like to ask me a question or make a comment? I see several people on here. We've got 81 people or more on, and that's really exciting. Just briefly, while I'm waiting for questions, some of the questions that I get asked most often have to do with what the U.S. is doing in Syria. And people talk about the U.S. being the policeman of the world. Well, folks, the world did not ask for us to be their policeman. And usually our police forces act more like a Gestapo force or a mafioso force than what Americans might be expecting. What has happened in Syria is that the U.S. Actually created this war. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand because they've never heard it. In fact, the plans for this particular war really started in the early 2000s. It had been planned really since well before 9/11, but after 9/11, when the neocons took over, I'm having trouble seeing the comments. When the neocons took over, they initiated what is called the 7 countries in 5 years plan, and this is something that General Wesley Clark spoke of in 2007. And the plan was for the U.S. to literally take out 7 countries over the next 5 years, and that was back in 2001. So they were going to start with Iraq, go to Lebanon, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and ending with Iran. And this is actually what we've seen playing out over the course of the last 17 years, much of it. So Syria was on the hit list, if you will, from way back. And in 2004, Colin Powell went to Damascus, and he laid out a series of dictates, if you will, in order for President Assad accordingly to stay in power, that we would allow him to stay in power if they would accede to these dictates. Well, the answer was no. The answer was, we'll listen to advice, but we don't accept dictates. And most of the dictates had to do with really pandering to Israel's desires to end support for the resistance in the occupied territories in Gaza and the West Bank, etc. So that was the bulk of the request, and to help us destroy Iraq. In 2005, Christiane Amanpour of CNN went to Damascus and told President Assad that the U.S. Was talking about regime change in Syria, and they were already picking out new leaders for Syria. So that was 2005. In 2006, the Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Damascus wrote a cable literally outlining the plan of undermining the Syrian Arab Republic's government and the leadership of President Assad. This was in 2006, and it's interesting that that document actually talks a lot about how Syria is in a stronger position than ever. They're doing well both domestically and internationally, and yet, there's still these holes that we can use to maybe kind of wedge and capitalize on to undermine this government. So don't be deceived, people in America. We planned this war. We sent weapons and money, and we provided intelligence support to terrorist groups, just as we did in Libya. And this is what Syria has been fighting now for 7 years. I'm going to try to see if I can read some comments here. I apologize. I'm having some trouble getting to see them. So if you have a question, please ask it now because I can keep talking, but I wanted to hear from you. Another question is, what is President Assad really like? And I can tell you that I have no doubt he has the support of the great majority of the Syrian people. And Dr. Khaldoun Mahmoud just said about 80%, over 80%, support their president. The people of Syria, in Syria, over 80% support their president. And I believe this is a true figure from the conversations that I've had. Now, people say, well, they're going to tell you that they support President Assad because they're fearful of the regime and they'll get arrested or tortured or killed if they say differently. I'm sorry, that is not the case. The Syrian people are very forthcoming with criticisms. They're very pragmatic. I want you to know they know exactly everything that CNN has been saying, MSNBC, Fox News, BBC, The Guardian, the New York Times. They have access to all of that stuff. They have free open access, or they have open access to the internet. And thank you, Nasser. And so they are very well aware of all of the accusations and allegations that have been made against their president and army. And guess what? They don't buy them, because these allegations were created using propaganda and false narratives in order to get people in the West, in America, to support a grotesque, hypocritical, deadly and destructive, illegal action against a sovereign, independent nation state that was no threat to the U.S. and had never invaded another country. And so in order to get people to support this plan of taking control of Syria, they had to create all of this incredible propaganda. And once you really see it and you understand the situation, most of it is absolutely absurd. I always tell people, whatever you see in the news, literally turn it 180 degrees opposite of what you hear, and you will be so much closer to the truth of what is really happening there. And this is why President Assad is still in power, because the Syrian people are very strong, very bright. They know their country very well. And if they did not want that man in power, I've almost staked my life on it many times. I would say that he would not be in power. In fact, he and his wife just drove themselves to Tartus, I guess it was yesterday, to visit a village there. And they went into a church, and as usual, people are swarming them around them, wanting to take selfies with them both. And so many people there absolutely adore them. And then there are a lot of people that support him because the current situation is just so much infinitely better than anything that the so-called rebels had to offer. Oh, thank you, Dan O'Day. Yeah, Pearson Sharp and Treka have been fabulous. If you don't know Treka, he is a Syrian comedian in Damascus. He's a fabulous guy, great guy, and he's very funny, but he also does wonderful political commentaries, and he has a page called Treka ZN. And if you go there, you'll find some fabulous stuff. And Pearson Sharp, Dan O'Day just made a comment that says, you, Pearson Sharp, and Treka have opened my eyes Pearson Sharp is of One America News, and he had done some excellent reports before he went to Syria, but he was in Syria of April this past year, and I was there at the same time, and Pearson just blew the doors off a lot of these false narratives, particularly about the chemical weapons attack, the alleged attack in Duma. And I will put the links to some of his great reports from Syria on the ground that Pearson Sharp did. Yes, and Samson Sommer, I think that's the right pronunciation, mentioned another friend, Kavork Almasian. He runs Syriana Analysis, a brilliant guy, Syrian from Aleppo. And if you just follow his page, you will find out the real news and the truth of what's going on in Syria, both kind of as a breaking news thing and as background and insightful analysis. So I really recommend you following Kavork. So going back, I'll just continue this thread of what America has done in Syria. Back when the Benghazi compound was attacked and Ambassador Stevens was killed, it's important to understand that, again, the narratives that we were given about the war in Libya to justify that intervention that made Libya a living hell. The false narratives that we were given were just nonsense about Colonel Gaddafi all of a sudden going crazy and he was going to kill all the Sunnis or some stupid thing. And we went in and destroyed Syria. We destroyed Libya. And the Benghazi compound was actually a gun-running operation. The CIA and State Department jointly were literally running weapons from Gaddafi's arsenal into terrorist rebels in Syria. And so every time that you hear about so-called moderate rebels, you have to understand that what the U.S. calls a moderate rebel is not someone that's like Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia rebels. They all share the same basic ideology as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They've all imposed Sharia law wherever they've taken control. They've all put women under enslavement, forced to wear hijab, forced sometimes to wear the full burqa. They've all run their areas similar to how ISIS and Al-Qaeda run theirs. The reason why we call them moderate rebels is because we don't consider them a threat to the United States. And so that's a nuance that most people don't get. So a group can be running around Syria, literally massacring Christian villages, massacring Alawite villages, massacring Shiite villages, killing Sunnis too with their snipers and car bombs and mortar attacks and what have you. They can kidnap priests, they can behead them, they kidnap people, thousands and thousands and thousands of people all around the country. Often those poor victims were tortured. Even if the ransom was met, they were still tortured. Many of them were killed in homes. I know that there were many times when a kidnapped victim, somebody whose family couldn't raise the ransom, was literally hacked to pieces, and their pieces were left on some of the main roads there to act as warnings for other people. So we're talking about groups that were directly supported by the United States of America with advanced weaponry, thanks to people like Senator John McCain, Mark Rubio, Lindsey Graham, etc., and of course our State Department, CIA, Pentagon. And these people had had determined to literally terrorize the people of Syria to get them to go under submission to them. But what they didn't count on was the people of Syria are really amazingly strong, and they refused to submit. And this is where we have to talk a little bit about the Syrian Arab Army. And the Syrian Arab Army, for those of us who have been following this conflict every day, all day for years, they're our heroes. They're normal guys. I mean, these are just guys and many women from all over Syria, again, all religious groups. It's a secular army, of course. And they have held strong, and they have bled. There are families that have lost all of their sons fighting this war. There are guys that have been in the trenches now for 8, 9 years, even because they were in the army before the war started. These guys there have been battles where, there have been 70% casualties. If the Syrian Arab Army has not lost at least 150,000 guys, I will be shocked, because they have sacrificed to save their families and their homeland from these so-called stupid head-chopping thugs that the United States of America, Britain, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey have been supporting all this time. All of these groups are armed and funded and supported by outside countries. And this is where, when I start talking like this, people say in America, well, why? Why would America do such a thing? Why are we supporting terrorists? Well, this isn't brand new. I mean, we started doing this in Afghanistan in the 80s with the Taliban and Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And now what do we have? We are literally, our guys are fighting those groups in Afghanistan, and we've been at it for 17 years, and there's no end in sight. Michael Dianguera says Syria is a miracle. Just think they were able to defy Western efforts to remake them. I love the support the Syrian Arab Army has from the people, and yes, I do too. When areas are liberated from these terrorist groups, we have many videos of Vanessa Beeley, of Reverend Andrew Ashdown were there when this was happening in Aleppo in December of 2016. And I was watching one of my favorite Syrian reporters, Shadi Halbawali. I think I might have messed up his name there. But literally, these people were coming from eastern Aleppo, and they were running towards the army guys. And so many of them were just smiling and so happy to be finally free of those terrorist groups and the fighting. They were well taken care of. There are many refugee centers around. They're not displaced persons within the country, but many centers for these people. I've been to several, and they are not housed in tents. They're put into buildings, sometimes schools that are being used for that purpose, or other buildings. They get food, they get medical care. Oh, thank you. Riyad Thomas, he says, I'm a Syrian from Home City. I can give my testimony that opposition used to fire guns and snipers from day one. This is to say since April 2011. Thank you so much for that testimony. To add to yours, we have the testimony also of Father Frans van der Loot, who was a Dutch Jesuit priest that had lived in Homs for decades. And he wrote a letter, and he described how the protesters shot first. This false narrative that the Syrian government brutally put down peaceful protests is a lie. It's a lie. What had happened, it's very complicated, but there were Islamists and there were Mujahideen from Saudi Arabia and other countries that were firing into the crowd and killing people, both security forces and civilians, creating chaos and violence. People had been paid to participate in violent protests. They had been sometimes given Captagon, which is a drug that is a little bit like crystal meth, from what I can understand. But Father Franz was very clear, and he said the protesters shot first. The Syrian army was trying to keep the peace. And in fact, for months after the violence began in March 2011, the Syrian security forces were not allowed to carry loaded weapons. And they were in those protests with just batons, and they were getting killed. And I think something like almost 1,000 Syrian security forces had died before the forces were fully armed. Thank you, Riyadh. So what we have with Syria is one false narrative after another. I'm kind of losing track of time. What time is it? 5:38. We had one false narrative after another. One, that it's a civil war. Nonsense. This was a manufactured war by the US, the UK, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, using the Muslim Brotherhood as a primary tool to create a rebellion. So it's not a civil war, it's a manufactured war. Two, that the war started when, the Assad regime brutally put down peaceful protesters. Again, that's false. These protests, the violent people in them had already been armed. They were stockpiling weapons in mosques that were radicalized mosques supported by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. And, it was literally just a fire that had been built and was just waiting for the flame to be set to it. And that's what happened in March 2011. Violence started. Since that time, America, again, Israel, has a key role to play in this. And I'd like to talk about Israel's role for a few minutes, because it has been long an ambition of many of Israel's leaders to create what's called Greater Israel, which is for Israel to control much of that northern swath of the Middle East. So we're talking Lebanon, Syria, some of Jordan, which is more in the south. But to take over those lands and call them their own, that's called the Greater Israel Project. Benjamin Netanyahu's father was very big in that movement. Benjamin Netanyahu himself has declared that he wants Israel to be an energy exporter. And he's been in power in Israel for 20 years. Israel, of course, has really dominant influence in American foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East region. And, one of the strategies that certain Israeli leaders and planners had come up with is something that we call the Oded Yinon plan. Oded Yinon is an Israeli. And it calls for the Middle East to be separated into, again, we're talking Syria, Iraq, etc., into small sectarian-based states. So in other words, let's just talk about Syria. In Syria, you have many different ethnic groups, like we've just talked about. So you have Arabs, and you have Kurds, and you have Assyrians, and you have many different ethnicities living in the country. You also have many different religious groups, and sometimes they're tied together and sometimes not. So you have Sunnis, you have Alawites, you have traditional Shiites, you have Christians, Druzi, Yazidis, there are 20-something of them. So this great plan of Israel's, and one that the U.S. adopted, Condoleezza Rice mentioned it, it's called the New Middle East, was to separate these strong countries into small sectarian-based little nation states that would be weak, that couldn't have a strong army, and that could provide no real resistance to anything Israel wanted to do or the West wanted to do in the Middle East. So, for example, you'd have a Sunni land and an Alawite land, and I think the Christians, I guess, were supposed to all end up in Lebanon. You'd have the Kurd land, etc. Well, this plan is stupid because for anyone who I don't claim to be an expert, but I have some understanding of Syria as a country. People are all mixed together. So you might have an area that they call, oh, this is Alawite territory, but there are a bunch of Sunnis in there, there are a bunch of Christians, and there are a bunch of Druze in there, etc. People are intermixed all around the country. Marriages are mixed even, oftentimes. So what this plan would have done literally is to guarantee endless war, that there would be nothing else that would result of this other than those small little states constantly fighting each other. And this would create opportunities for the US and UK, etc., and Israel to kind of do what they wanted. So look up what's called the Oded Yinon Plan, Yinon, and look up the New Middle East, Condoleezza Rice, and you'll see that what I'm saying is true. What they didn't take into account is that the Syrian people would not stand for this. And, the Syrian people, by unifying, by standing with their army and their president, have really brought all these malignant, reckless, deadly, destructive plans based on greed and arrogance by all these other powers, but particularly the US, Israel, UK, France, etc., has brought them to a stop. And they have actually won this war because they held their ground and they stood together. Not all of them, of course, but enough of them. And they did what it took. Most of the guys fighting, they're not fighting to bust the Oded Yinon plan or to bust the New American Century plan by the neocons. They're simply fighting because, one, they have to. It's a conscript army as well as volunteer army, but to save their families from being killed by these terrorist groups, and to save their country, their culture, this wonderful society that they have, to save that from these head-chopping thugs as well. But in the process of doing that, they have actually really turned things on its head. They've shaken things up. We call it the Assad must go curse. Those of us online that have been talking about this stuff, because all of these Western leaders, even the top leaders, almost all of them are gone now, who said, President Assad has to step down. He's got to go. None of them are in power still. There's still a few left to go. And I'm hoping that it affects them as well. So we will see. But so far, Syria has won this war. There are some battles that have to be fought, things that have to be taken care of, and the sanctions have to end for them to they would rebuild their country and become strong so quickly that it will astound the world. And even if the sanctions do not come off, they will still do it, and they're doing it right now. It's an amazing place, amazing people. I hope that anyone who wants to go will get a chance to go. Looks like tourism is going to open up again very soon. I think hopefully in 2019 here. I think oh, good, we still have time. So I will keep going, and I'm going to talk about being a tourist in Syria. Yes, Samson Summer says, who's next to fall victim to the Assad curse? My money is on Macron. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. Between the Assad must go curse and the yellow vests, I think that guy is out of there, which is great, because he was talking about, even if the U.S. does really actually keep their word for one time, just once, they're going to say something and actually do that thing. If they pull out of Syria, France was talking about staying in and continuing the war there. So that guy is off his rocker, and I hope he gets out of there. All these people in power in the West, it's not just Trump, it's not just Macron, it's not just Theresa May. these systems are in place to support these wars, to lie to the people of their countries, and it's a utterly corrupted situation. The media has been doing their bidding and literally protecting their narratives. And we have gotten to a situation now where, um, if somebody brings up a report from CNN or BBC or The Guardian or what have you, I just laugh, because you might as well be reading the National Enquirer. It's become such a joke, and this is why I think people instinctively know this. Many people I talk to do. This is why the viewership is so far down and the readership is so down. It's because people know, it's a show. It's entertainment. I would say that you could look at the news on our televisions at night and consider them to have as much integrity as a sitcom that you would watch about a hospital. There's no resemblance to actual reality on the few times that I sit down and listen to them. So online is really the only place that you can find real news, and you have to spend a lot of time filtering it all with common sense and learning and education and trying to figure out what's real and what's not. It's time consuming, it's hard, but it's necessary. We have to do these things. Yeah. The Oval Office, Michael says, is owned by the powerful. Anybody who wants to be president will have to do their bidding. And yes, people think of these, that is the reality. And this is why people call me and so many others conspiracy theorists. But really, when you take a minute to look at the United States of America, we have between 700 to 1,000 military bases around the world. Literally, the sun never sets on our military empire. We are a military commercial empire, very similar to the one that we threw off to become what's called the United States of America. If you consider, for example, the distance that it takes to stop a huge, whether it's a cruise liner ship or an aircraft carrier, I think it takes miles for them to come to a full stop or to make a turn. And so if you think of the United States as this huge, gigantic behemoth, with these 700 to 1,000 military bases, that structure cannot function on 4-year election cycles, where a lot of that time is taken up getting elected or reelected or getting other people in your party elected, what have you. It's impossible in my mind for that to be. So what you have is all of these backroom boys and girls that run the corporations, that run the financial world, that run the intelligence community, that run the military, what have you. These people are really running the show. But then you have this tier above them who are planning the show. And those are the people that we have to uncover, all of us. Those are the people that we have to identify, because we have to bring them out of the shadows. And once you do that, you have an ability to have an informed opinion. I hope I'm making sense here. This is a little bit difficult, and hopefully I'm not rambling too much. So we have this gigantic military-industrial intelligence complex that President Eisenhower warned us of, Douglas MacArthur warned us of, going all the way back to John Quincy Adams, who said we should not go in search of monsters to destroy, because if we do, we would become a tyrant. Well, that's exactly what we're doing. Our defense, our so-called Defense Department sucks up half or more of our budget, is responsible for most of our debt. but they have to justify their existence and more. They always want more and more and more, and they call it defense. But what it is them they've become a self-feeding beast. And so you have, the intelligence agencies are not really held accountable. The Pentagon has lost trillions of dollars that they can't account for. And those of us, we've not only sacrificed our tax dollars, our children's tax dollars, our children's tax dollars. These wars have been fought on credit cards, basically. But we have given these warmongers and war profiteers our children, our sons and daughters, and said, here, take our sons and daughters. We're offering them to you as a sacrifice for your wealth and your greed and your power ambitions. And this is why every American has to fall in hate with our government's policies. Because they literally have us now not only sacrificing our children, as Major General Smedley Butler said, this was back before World War II, early on in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. He said he was the most decorated soldier of his time, and he said, I was nothing more than a thug for Wall Street and for bankers. I have two sons. My husband and I have two sons of military age. And if there was a draft, or if they were thinking about going in the military, which they're awake and they're smarter than that, thank you, Lord, I would whack them over the head and put them on a freighter going to God knows where somewhere to get them out of it. Because don't be telling me to support our troops when the people who are sending our troops overseas are sending them over there for wars based on lies, to kill people who are no threat and no enemy to the United States of America, whose job is to die or to get injured or to get PTSD or to get addicted to drugs, so that very rich people can get a lot richer and very powerful people can get more powerful. I refuse to accept that as an American. I refuse to stop trying to wake up other Americans to what is really going on. And this is, of the two main reasons I go to Syria. One, I love Syria. Two, I hate these wars and these foreign policies based on lies. And so that's really all I have for you tonight. I don't think I really answered many of the comments. I'm sorry, I'm new to this. But I did want to do something at the end if there's any Syrians still on with me. This is a glass with arak in it and water, and arak is kind of the national drink of Syria. It's distilled from grapes and has aniseed flavoring. It's yummy, and you put water in it and it turns this milky white. And so to end our evening tonight, I just wanted to drink a toast to Syria, to the Syrian Arab Army, to President Bashar al-Assad, to the wonderful Syrian people who have really showed us what it takes to make a stand. And thank you for your courage. Thank you for your endurance. And thank you most of all for showing me such great love and friendship in all these journeys. I can't ever thank you enough. So cheers to you, Syria. And good night, friends. If there are any questions I missed or anything that I need to comment on, I'll follow up on those tomorrow. Thank you for joining me, and have a good night.